Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
"You've been comfortable too long," she said, standing in front of my desk like some stern librarian catching a teenager watching porn on the public computer. Tammy Gates, human resources with the warmth of a wet sock, gestured to the hallway with a practiced flick of her perfectly manicured fingers, the kind of nails that never clicked on a keyboard. I looked at her, then over at my half-full coffee mug still steaming on the coaster, then back at her. No dramatics. No speeches. Just a quiet nod, the kind that said, "Yeah, I saw this coming a mile away." She wanted it to sting. That's how HR works. They package humiliation as procedure and hope you'll flinch. But here's the thing they didn't know. I had already flinched. Months ago. In silence. Alone at home with a stiff drink and that cold churn in my gut that tells you your time's running out, even if no one said it out loud yet. I flinched when they started cutting me out of meetings. I flinched when my direct reports started getting redirected without so much as a CC. I flinched when I saw that new hire, Jeremy, fresh out of undergrad and barely old enough to rent a car, grinning through a presentation that looked suspiciously like mine from last quarter. But today, no flinch. Just the quiet thud of resignation, and maybe a little bit of grim satisfaction. Because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know what I'd set up. Derek Nolan, my boss, or whatever you'd call the guy who smiles while he kicks you under the table, was nowhere to be seen. Classic move. Let HR be the firing squad while he hides in his corner office pretending he's too busy to personally escort the dead man walking. I glanced toward the frosted glass where his name was etched like some kind of joke. He didn't come out. I didn't expect him to. He wasn't built for confrontation. Derek was the type who shakes your hand and then cuts your hours via email before lunch. Weak spine. Strong cologne. As we walked past rows of gray cubicles and ergonomic chairs that cost more than my daughter's braces, I noticed people pretending not to notice. That's the ritual. Look away, keep typing. Don't make eye contact with the ghost. My steps were slow, deliberate. Tammy didn't speak again. She knew better. I wasn't going to plead. I wasn't going to ask for a reason. The writing had been on the wall for months. It was just written in code only the expendable old guys like me could still read. At the door, she handed me a bland beige envelope with the company logo in the corner and the usual garbage printed inside. "Thank you for your contributions. This was a business decision. We wish you well in your future endeavors." The kind of letter that tastes like cardboard and shame if you read it too slow. I didn't. Once outside, I took a long breath. Not because I needed the air, but because I knew what came next. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Scrolled past the notifications, ignored the messages, and opened the app I'd built in the quiet hours. Those long, thankless nights when it became obvious they were pushing me out without actually saying it. I tapped the first button. One click. That was it. Silent. Clean. Delayed chaos. Inside, they were still sipping bad coffee and pretending Derek was some kind of visionary. Meanwhile, half the infrastructure that made their lives easy just received new orders. Subtle changes, not destruction. Not yet. More like a ghost in the machine. Things would get weird in a few days, maybe a week. Backup processes would misfire. Automated scripts would loop. Email systems would suddenly get flaky, but not broken. Just irritating. Like a splinter under the nail. And the best part? None of it could be traced. Because all those brilliant new hires? They didn't even know what half the legacy systems were built on. I'd buried those bones deep. And when they finally got desperate enough to dig, they'd still need the map. I smiled, almost in spite of myself. I hadn't planned this out of anger. This wasn't some emotional tantrum. It was math. Pure cause and effect. You treat people like trash long enough. Eventually you forget they might be the only ones holding the damn place together. I gave them 12 years, through 2 reorgs, 3 product launches, and a pandemic. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, even Linda's surgery to make sure Derek looked good in front of the board. And when the axe finally came down, they didn't even have the spine to tell me why. Just, "You've been comfortable too long." Like that's a sin. Be honest. Have you ever dreamed of getting sweet, satisfying revenge on a boss like that? I sat in my car, letting the engine idle, watching the front doors of the building like it might spit out some apology. Nothing came. Just the usual Monday shuffle. And I couldn't help thinking, how many of us have walked out those doors after being gutted, humiliated, discarded, pretending to be okay because that's what grown-ups do? Because we've got mortgages and kids and insurance plans tied to our dignity? Well, I wasn't pretending anymore. I was done being okay. I was done keeping the peace. The first trigger was just a warm-up. There were 3 more. One tied to calendar syncing, another to the finance reports, and the last one. Well, let's just say when it goes off, someone's going to regret handing Jeremy admin privileges he never earned. I pulled out of the parking lot with the same calm I used to pull all-nighters fixing the servers these clowns didn't even know existed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud and sloppy. What I felt was colder, deeper, and a hell of a lot more dangerous. They thought they fired me, but all they did was release me. Next stop? Home. Step 2. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally get some sleep tonight. After all, I'd earned it. It started like most slow deaths, quiet, subtle, and easy to ignore if you weren't the one bleeding. The kind of erosion that doesn't make a sound until the floor's already caved in beneath your feet. 6 months ago, I was still sitting in the same squeaky chair, drinking the same lukewarm coffee, and convincing myself that the weird tension in the air was just part of the job, not the prelude to an execution. But deep down, something in me had already started twitching. Not fear, exactly, more like the way a dog perks up right before the thunder hits. The first real clue wasn't even that big. Just an email thread I should have been on but wasn't. A project kickoff for a migration I had laid the groundwork for the previous quarter, my architecture, my schedule, my damn notes still pinned to the whiteboard. Yet there it was, flying around without my name on it, like I'd never touched the thing. I remember blinking at the screen for a full minute, like I was trying to will my name into existence. Then I forwarded the thread to myself, wrote a small note, keep an eye on this, and dropped it into a folder I'd later label insurance. That folder grew fast, faster than it should have. Every week, something else got quietly reassigned, scrubbed of my fingerprints, passed off to someone who didn't even know what subnetting was last year. And standing in the middle of it all like a proud, clueless peacock was Jeremy. Fresh out of grad school, teeth too white, shoes too clean, talking like a podcast host who read a book on office culture, but skipped the chapter on humility. He asked questions like, do we even need a local backup system anymore? And offered ideas like, let's shift everything to the cloud and just see what happens. The first time I heard that, I almost laughed coffee through my nose. The second time, I realized he wasn't joking. Derek loved Jeremy, of course. Said he brought fresh energy, which I guess is just code for young, dumb, and easy to mold. I tried to let it roll off. I've been around long enough to know that companies fall in love with shiny things every few years. New tech, new hires, new mission statements that sound like TED Talks and smell like bullshit. But this time, it felt different. This time, they weren't adding, they were replacing. Quietly, like a magician pulling off a trick with slow fingers and steady eyes. Linda noticed it before I admitted it out loud. One night, after I came home late again with that hollow, 1,000-yard stare only corporate betrayal can give a man, she slid a glass of scotch across the table and said, "You're not paranoid. You're next." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. She knew. She always knew. I told her I'd ride it out, just long enough to hit the full pension window, but even as I said it, I felt like I was lying to both of us. Something in me had already shifted from defensive to dangerous. That week, I started building the shadow copy. It wasn't malicious. Not at first. It was just insurance. All the legacy scripts, the integration pathways, the private logs I'd maintained off-server just because no one else bothered to document anything correctly, it all started going into an encrypted drive under my personal credentials. Hidden, segmented, and backed up in places no one else would think to look. If I was going down, I wasn't going down without leverage. Cheryl helped without knowing she helped. Sharp as a tack, quiet as a cat, she was one of the last people in that place who actually understood how the guts of the system worked. She hated Derek almost as much as I did, but she wasn't reckless. She'd drop little hints, things like, you might want to grab a copy of that config before Jeremy deletes it, or, I think someone's messing with your permissions again. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, but enough to keep me 10 steps ahead. Every night, after hours, I'd stay behind. Not too long, just long enough to check logs, copy critical updates, and run integrity tests on my little arc. I even built a backdoor. Encrypted, naturally. Undetectable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. And let's be honest, they weren't. They were too busy fawning over Jeremy's new dashboard interface that looked pretty but did nothing useful. It was like putting a leather steering wheel on a car with no engine. By the time the third project went live without my name anywhere near it, I stopped pretending I was still part of the team. I was a ghost in a room full of parrots, And every time Derek praised someone else for a system I had silently duct taped together at 3 in the morning, something inside me cracked a little more. Not from pride, I never cared about the spotlight, but from the sheer gall of it all. The way they rewrote history while I was still standing in the damn building. The final straw came during a Friday culture hour, which is code for beer and lies in the break room. Derek raised his overpriced IPA and toasted Jeremy's incredible work modernizing the deployment strategy. I stood there holding a plastic cup of warm soda, listening to Jeremy describe a system I'd built 2 years ago like it was his weekend hackathon project. And no one corrected him. No one even looked uncomfortable. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't being phased out, I was already gone. That night, I went home and finished step 1 of the trigger system. Not active yet. Just a shell. But it was enough to start something. Enough to make sure that when the end came, and I knew it would, I wouldn't walk out empty-handed. They thought I was just some tired old guy counting the days to retirement. They had no idea I'd already started counting something else. Lines of code. Chains of dependency. And the slow, methodical collapse of a system built on arrogance. Let's see how comfortable they feel 6 months from now. There's a specific kind of silence that fills a conference room right after someone takes credit for your work, and it's not the stunned, outraged kind you might hope for. It's more like the dead, complicit quiet of people who knew it was coming and decided to let it happen anyway. I sat there at the far end of the table with a notebook in front of me, pen in hand, trying not to let my jaw clench as Derek ran through the slide deck that looked eerily familiar because, well, I built every damn element of the system he was now claiming to have streamlined personally. He even threw in a few techie buzzwords he clearly didn't understand, just to impress the suits. And they lapped it up like gravy at a corporate Thanksgiving. Sandra Lutz, the company VP with a voice like velvet-wrapped knives, gave Derek one of those nods that says, "You've done well, and I might remember your name in a budget meeting." She didn't even glance at me. Not once. I was invisible. And worse than that, I was expected to applaud. Expected to smile along like a good soldier watching his general pin medals on a guy who barely knew which side of the battlefield he was supposed to stand on. Rich sat 2 seats down, pretending to type something urgent on his laptop. He knew. Hell, he was there during the planning sessions, watched me rewrite half the network allocation framework by hand when the vendors failed to deliver. But he didn't say a word. Didn't even flinch. That's when I knew he'd picked a side, and it wasn't mine. We did beers together, swapped stories about bad bosses and worse deadlines, and now he couldn't even meet my eyes. Traitors don't always carry knives. Sometimes they just carry silence. After the meeting, Derek made a point to stop by my desk with that smug expression he probably practiced in the mirror. "Great to have you backing me up in there, Mike," he said, like we were co-conspirators in some thrilling heist instead of accomplice and victim. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, friendly, firm, fake, and then leaned in just enough to whisper, "By the way, I've got a new guy starting next week. Fresh out of MIT. Would be great if you could, bring him up to speed. Show him the ropes, that kind of thing." It took everything I had not to laugh in his face right then and there. That was the tell. That was the moment I realized I wasn't even a player in this game anymore. I was a tutorial level for some kid in a hoodie and brand new MacBook to fumble through before they handed him my chair and pretended the rest never happened. They weren't just phasing me out. They were replacing me like a printer cartridge, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. That night, I stayed late. Not for them. Not for loyalty. For survival. I went into the system under my admin profile, one they still hadn't revoked full privileges from because, frankly, no one else knew how deep the layers ran. I encrypted key documentation across 3 servers and wrote time release locks that would trip if tampered with by unauthorized users. Nothing destructive yet. Just inconvenient. Confusing. A digital maze that only I knew the path through. I tagged every critical deployment with internal logs that would vanish if copied incorrectly. Layered monitoring tools behind innocuous-looking batch files. Invisible fingerprints in a house I'd built with my own hands. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was insurance. This was the seatbelt you fasten after realizing the driver is aiming for the guardrail. When the successor showed up the following Monday, his name was Callum or Camden or something equally designed for LinkedIn glory. Nice kid, actually. Polite. Nervous. He shook my hand with both of his like I was some legend he read about in an onboarding PDF. He kept calling me sir, which didn't piss me off the way I thought it might. Mostly I just felt sorry for him. He had no idea he was walking into a burning building with a blindfold on. They put him in the cube next to mine and asked me to mentor him through the knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer. That's what they called it. Not theft. Not replacement. Not slow-motion betrayal dressed up in HR-friendly language. Just transfer. Like I was a damn USB stick getting handed off before they tossed me in the drawer. I did my job. I trained him. I answered questions. I smiled when I had to. But behind the scenes, I kept building. Kept updating the systems only I knew how to navigate. Every process I showed him came with a few pieces missing, small ones, nothing obvious, just enough that if I vanished tomorrow, the machine would grind and stall and sputter like an old truck with a dirty fuel line. And maybe that makes me a bastard. Maybe it does. But you tell me, what would you do? What would you do if your legacy was being peeled away from you one line of code at a time, handed to a kid too green to even recognize the weight of it? What would you do if your so-called friend sat silent while your boss smiled through a knife to the ribs? Because I'll tell you what I did. I started building something stronger than a resignation letter. Something quieter than a lawsuit. I started building a reckoning. And by the time they realized what was happening, they'd already be neck-deep in it. They stabbed me with a smile. I smiled back. And then I sharpened my tools. 3 weeks after I walked out of that office without looking back, the storm finally arrived, not all at once, of course, but in slow, twitching waves of confusion, delay, and technical chaos that no one seemed able to trace. The first reports started trickling into my inbox via forwarded messages from a few people who hadn't yet realized I was no longer under company NDA. Things like, payroll import isn't syncing with legacy vendor forms, please advise. Or, why are last month's backups redirecting to deprecated storage notes? Simple questions from people who didn't realize the entire system had been resting on a foundation held together by the very guy they quietly walked out the door. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee going lukewarm beside my laptop, watching the slow unraveling like it was a nature documentary, fascinating in its rhythm, painful in its inevitability. It was never about destruction, not really. Destruction is easy to spot, easy to blame. What I built was subtle. 1,000 paper cuts hidden beneath polite automation. Triggers set on intervals, scripts with conditional logic designed to fail only when no one remembered what they were supposed to do in the first place. It wasn't a bomb. It was time and entropy laced with just enough deliberate decay to bring the walls crumbling down from the inside out. By Tuesday of that third week, it had hit their email servers. First, the executive calendar wouldn't sync properly with the external client coordination system. Then, the internal comms API began looping timestamps and corrupting thread chains. Rich, apparently now promoted to interim IT lead, a job title that tastes like vinegar when said aloud, tried rerouting through a secondary pathway I'd intentionally mislabeled in the documentation. By noon, the finance team's automated reporting suite was down, and by Wednesday morning, payroll had processed a second run that paid 300 people twice and left the rest flagged as terminated. That's when the phone rang. Not a call from HR. Not a call from Sandra, who'd vanished into executive silence like all good VPs do when things go sideways. No, this call came from Derek himself, his number lit up on my screen like an old wound suddenly itching. I let it ring 4 times before answering, just to let the silence work on him a little. Mike, he said, his voice tight but trying to sound casual, like we were still colleagues and he hadn't personally tossed me to the curb. Hey, man. Look, we're dealing with a few snags in the rollout. Wondering if you might be willing to help us troubleshoot. Maybe off the record? We'd obviously compensate you for your time. I leaned back in my chair, let the grin spread slowly across my face, the kind you wear when your enemy finally walks into the trap you stopped thinking about weeks ago. You need help, Derek? That's wild. I thought Jeremy and Camden had it all under control. What happened to fresh energy? He paused, and I could hear him swallow his pride through the line. Yeah, well, they're doing their best, but there are some, legacy complexities we weren't aware of. I let that phrase hang there in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Legacy complexities. That's what they called me in the end, wasn't it? Too slow, too comfortable, too old school to fit into their agile new structure. Now those legacy complexities were chewing through their precious systems one unnoticed bite at a time. I might be able to help, I said, sipping my coffee with deliberate slowness, but I don't work cheap. And I sure as hell don't work quietly. He hesitated. I could picture him, sitting in that too-big chair in his too-clean office, trying to figure out if this was salvageable or if he needed to call legal. What's your number? I gave him a figure that would have made me blush 3 years ago. He didn't even argue. just muttered something about approvals and follow-ups and hung up. It would have been almost pitiful if it wasn't so predictable. Later that day, I got a message from Nate, the intern I once helped sneak snacks into the server room during late-night patch cycles. He'd grown quiet since I left, but I figured he'd keep his head down and stay out of the fallout. His message was short. "Did you do this?" "Nothing else." "Just that." I typed back, "Do what?" He didn't reply for hours. When he finally did, he said, "Whatever it is, they deserve it. But if you're not done, be careful. They're watching everything now." I smiled at that, because Nate knew what the rest didn't. The real damage hadn't even started yet. What they'd seen so far was only the erosion of convenience. The next wave was about trust. See, all those systems they depended on, shared calendars, client directories, contract archives, internal messages, vendor workflows, all of them had been duct-taped together with my logic. Some of it old, some of it newer, and all of it tied into processes no one ever bothered to learn because they assumed I'd always be there to explain. But I wasn't there anymore. And the manual they needed? It didn't exist. At least not for them. They'd spend days fixing one problem just to trigger another. Calls to vendors would get them nowhere. Rich would start pointing fingers, probably at Jeremy or Cheryl or whoever happened to be near the blast radius that week. Executives would panic. Deadlines would get missed. And through it all, I'd stay quiet, waiting for them to realize that what they broke wasn't just a system, it was the one person who knew where the bones were buried and which wires not to cut. The price I named wasn't just about money. It was about forcing them to admit they'd made a mistake. That maybe the old dog knew a few tricks after all. But even if they paid it, I wasn't sure I'd actually help. Not completely. Because somewhere deep in my code, somewhere tucked between the logic gates and triggers, I had written one final truth. Never underestimate the guy who built the foundation just because he stopped wearing a badge. And that truth was about to echo through every hallway of that building whether they were ready or not. The diner smelled like burnt toast and old coffee, exactly the kind of place you pick when you want to have a conversation that doesn't end up on any company calendar or legal transcript. It was quiet, too, save for the low murmur of retirees arguing over politics and the occasional hiss of bacon hitting a greasy flat top behind the counter. I was already seated in the booth when the lawyer walked in, briefcase in hand, suit too stiff for a place with a laminated menu and waitresses named things like Barb and Joe. He looked around like he'd never stepped into a place that served food under $10, and for a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave. But then he saw me, nodded once, and made his way over with the hesitant gait of a man who expected resistance but hoped for something softer. He introduced himself, some sanitized name I immediately forgot, and ordered black coffee with a forced smile, like pretending to be relaxed might make this conversation easier for both of us. It didn't. He pulled out a folder the color of old bone and slid it across the table toward me with practiced grace. "We'd like to retain you as a consultant," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world to offer money to the man who just turned their digital kingdom into a haunted house of forgotten commands and broken dependencies. I didn't touch the folder. I let it sit there between us, a line drawn in formica and ink. "Retain," I said, letting the word hang for a second. "Interesting choice." He tried to chuckle, but it landed flat. He launched into a spiel about transitional support, how things had become more complicated than anticipated, how certain legacy protocols weren't responding correctly and their internal staff was struggling to recover critical workflows, which was corporate speak for, "We broke it, we panicked, and now we're begging." He mentioned the number. It was generous. Shockingly so. Enough to buy a car, maybe two. Enough to make a man think twice, especially if that man still had bills, still had kids in college, still cared what bridges he burned along the way. But I wasn't that man anymore. Not exactly. I looked at the number, then at him, and finally asked the only question that mattered to me at that moment. "Is Derek still there?" The lawyer hesitated, just a fraction too long, and then said, "Yes, but his role is under review." I leaned back in the booth and smiled, not the smug kind, but the kind that comes from seeing karma do its slow crawl right on schedule. "Then no deal," I said, and meant it, because it was never just about the money or the systems or the insult. It was about the principle, about dignity, about watching the people who thought they could get a man's worth finally realize they'd been leaning on him the whole damn time. We sat in silence for a moment before he gathered his papers and stood. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, just nodded like he was checking off a box that said, "Tried to fix it the polite way." I watched him walk out, shoulders tight, phone already in hand, probably calling someone to tell them the dinosaur wasn't playing ball. I left the diner a few minutes later, leaving my half-drunk coffee behind, the bitterness lingering more on my tongue than in my mood. Back home, the house was quiet. Linda was out visiting her sister, and I had the place to myself for the first time in what felt like weeks. I walked into my office, the real one, not the beige box they'd kicked me out of, and powered up the secure terminal I'd kept off the grid since the day they let me go. The screen came to life slowly, blinking to attention like an old friend stretching its limbs after a long nap. I entered the passcode, waited for the encrypted system to unlock, and stared at the dashboard of logs, alerts, and the slow crawl of their recovery. They were patching things now. I could see it. Bit by bit, someone was trying to stitch the system back together, but it wasn't elegant. It was messy, panicked, inefficient. They were using workarounds I'd considered and dismissed years ago. Redundant, bloated, insecure. They were solving problems like people who didn't understand the original design because the person who designed it had been escorted out with a single sentence and zero ceremony. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe. Dad? The voice on the other end was soft, nervous. Sophie, is it true? She asked, skipping pleasantries, diving straight into the heart of it the way only a teenager could. People at school are saying you crashed your company's systems, that you got fired and hacked them. I closed my eyes for a second, the weight of it all pressing against my chest, not guilt, not shame, just the heavy ache of being misunderstood by someone you love. I didn't hack anything, I said, keeping my voice even. I just stopped helping. There was a pause, and then she laughed, not mocking but marveling. That's actually kind of badass, she said, and I could hear the pride bleeding through the static. I mean, everyone's talking about it. You're like a legend or something. I smiled, the real kind this time, not for vengeance or validation, but because for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. Don't believe everything you hear, I said. And maybe don't repeat it too loud at school. After we hung up, I turned back to the screen. I scrolled through the final logs, the last few scripts that hadn't activated yet, still waiting patiently like trained dogs on a leash. I hovered the mouse over the terminal, opened the secure shell, and typed in one final command. Not to cause more chaos. Not to make a point. Just to walk away clean. Log out. The screen blinked once, then went black, the hum of the terminal fading as the fan slowed and stopped. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence I'd earned. The kind of silence you only get after finishing something you never thought you'd have the courage to start. I left the office without turning the machine back on. Let them figure it out. Let them wonder how deep it went. Let them remember that the quiet ones usually write the rules.